You ever just sit in front of your large Steam library, completely void of emotion, bored beyond imagination, trying to find something that could possibly capture your attention? As you scroll through the vastness of expenditures, nothing really catches your eye. You click on the big titles, Grand Theft Auto 5, Fallout New Vegas, Skyrim, you think maybe if I just play through one of these games, it could cure my boredom for a while. But no, you don't settle on any of them. Something completely random appears in the corner of your eye. A game you practically forgot you owned. Well, for you that game is probably Dino D-Day, but for me it was a Gauntlet game from 2014. I go through a conundrum like the one I've just described fairly often, but I noticed that this game has just hit its 10-year release anniversary, and I ended up playing it for well over an hour, which for me is a lot in one sitting. I always found this game to be somewhat of a hidden gem, so I figured I would talk about it into the vast emptiness of YouTube. For those that do not know, Gauntlet is an existing franchise. It was originally an arcade game back in 1985. The game was pretty good for the time, allowing for 4 players at once. You could play from a selection of 4 characters: Thor the Warrior, Merlin the Wizard, Thyra the Valkyrie, or Questor the Elf. They are only referred to as their class names in game, however. By modern standards, the characters are about what you would expect, and the enemies were no different. The Warrior was best in melee, the Wizard had powerful magic, the Valkyrie had tons of armor, and the Elf was the fastest. The enemies consisted of ghosts, thieves, sorcerers, and stuff like that, and the gameplay boiled down to figuring out a fairly confusing maze. The sequel, Gauntlet 2, was simply an upgrade on the original more than anything else. For example, more than one player could play as a single character, simply with swapped palettes to differentiate them. However, it appears that there are 2 third installments of the franchise, Gauntlet the Third Encounter and Gauntlet 3 the Final Quest. The Third Encounter, however, was released first in 1990. The franchise had been owned by Atari Games this entire time, and for this particular installment, they only released it on their handheld, the Atari Lynx. In other words, the average person does not know this game exists, and I myself have never played it. The Final Quest, on the other hand, was made by Tengen, who developed the NES ports for Gauntlet 1 and 2, which I think I might own. Nonetheless, this game was made for a random assortment of home computers, most notably the Commodore 64. It probably has not held up to the test of time as well as its predecessors that were released on a Nintendo console. Safe to say the ZX Spectrum simply does not harness the same following as the Nintendo Entertainment System. Gauntlet 4 released on the Sega Genesis and added more RPG-like elements such as character leveling. It also featured a direct port of the original arcade game for whatever reason. A more popular release was the N64 and PlayStation entry to the franchise, Gauntlet Legends. I'll point out that I have never played this game before grabbing some footage for it, but it seems like it's just a dungeon crawler hack and slash game that adds a lot more to the original game, like a story and character stats, along with secret unlockable characters. Finally, there was an entry to the franchise for the PlayStation 2 called Gauntlet 7 Sorrows in 2005. This is not remotely part of my point, but apparently John Romero of id Software fame actually begun work on this game, but ended up quitting, and his 2 character designs were removed from the game. Anyways, the actual point I've been building up to is that 9 years later, the Gauntlet remake was released, and the franchise has been eerily quiet ever since. It was technically re-released in 2015 as Gauntlet Slayer Edition, which I will henceforth refer to it as. My question is, why? Why was this the final nail in the coffin for the franchise? I already referred to it as a hidden gem because I do not think it sold all that well. It was also met with impressively mediocre ratings from critics. My judgment of hidden gem is less to do with the game being fantastic and more about how surprisingly unheard of it is. That being said, I do think the game is pretty solid. Considering that the original Gauntlet is an absolute classic arcade game and the sequel is a solid NES port, I just find Slayer Edition's flop surprising. Although my surprise mainly comes from both the developer and publisher. Something I've withheld from you all this whole time is that the Slayer Edition was developed by Arrowhead. That's right, the same studio that developed Helldivers 2. Although this game was not published by Sony, its publisher was Warner Bros., and I'd argue that that is still a fairly household name, and I would imagine they'd be able to push a game pretty well. Based on these standards that I have objectively completely made up, I guess they just did not make the mark. It did not sell all that well, and the franchise never saw another entry. Despite that, I still think the game is worth talking about for me, as it was kind of a childhood favorite to play with family members. It offered the same 4 characters, along with a DLC character called the Necromancer, who was pretty overpowered. The game had a story mode where you went through each level and got deeper and deeper into a gauntlet made by an evil wizard by the name of Morak. The story is pretty thin and essentially unimportant. Different areas of the gauntlet were marked by bosses and featured different themes and enemy types. There was also an endless mode, which is what I frequented after beating the game for the first time. Booting up endless mode with 3 or 4 people was an insanely fun experience. Once you get around floor 30, it just becomes next to impossible, and you fight to every last inch as your team finally crumbles under the massive hordes of enemies. I'm a sucker for a good couch co-op game, and this one certainly fits the bill for me. The more people you have, up to 4, the more fun this game can be. The thing I liked most about this game was the customization for the characters. You could select from unique abilities, and each character would have its own gold deposit you could spend on these abilities and various other upgrades. This made grabbing gold a legitimate secondary goal within the level and fun competition amongst the players to fight over the last gold coin while still having to work together to survive the horde hunting them down. Every character has a potion ability, summon ability, and some kind of recharge ability. These kind of things can be swapped out and upgraded. Aside from these things, even the characters at default are still very unique. It adds some replayability to the game, which is something it otherwise kind of lacks because it gets fairly repetitive fairly quickly. Before I get into my main issue with the game, I want to talk about my favorite character, Merlin the Wizard. I simply love the spell mechanic they use for this character. Essentially, 3 buttons, the X, Y, and B buttons on an Xbox controller, are each tied to a single element. These elements can be swapped out with various spellbooks, but for the default, the left button is ice, the top button is fire, and the right button is lightning. You can double tap any one of the buttons to get a spell of that pure element. Ice is a big beam that does damage over time and locks you in place. Fire is a simple fireball with a high rate of fire. Lightning is a shield you can place down and stand inside of. Then each order you can press 2 different buttons in is also a spell that combines those 2 elements. Essentially, it allows you to get 9 different spells out of only 3 buttons, and it remains quite intuitive in my opinion. This is a completely useless tangent, and I was really just saying I like the way they did the wizard mechanics, and I want to make my own game that does something similar. Considering Arrowhead also made Magicka, I think they might just have some good experience with wizardry mechanics. Anyways, the previously mentioned repetition is my only gripe with the game, and it is a legitimate complaint. The combat breaks down to a very simple formula for the most part. You get locked into a room with a couple spawners and a horde. You take out the horde and deal with the enemies spawning in as you take out the spawners. You grab some gold and food, and you do it again. The campaign also has some pretty linear puzzle elements and various stuff like that, but the Slayer Edition definitely drops the maze-like gameplay from the original arcade version. In the campaign, the areas change often enough that you're fighting new enemies just often enough that the campaign itself does not get that stale on the first run through. Once you have played as much of the endless mode as I have, you definitely start to see the combat and enemy formulas. Playing it for the first time in years, however, was remarkably fun. I think the same thing can be said for playing it with a new group of friends, for example. The game is a little repetitive and lacks some replayability. This, I suspect, is why critics saw it as average and thus it did not sell all that well. These complaints are accurate, but I do think there is more to be said about the game. I think it serves as a great party game. It is not meant to be a prolonged playthrough where you will probably begin to tire of the repetition, but instead something you pick up with a couple friends every now and then. In this case, I think the game works perfectly. More so than anything, I think Slayer Edition is a great vision of the original Gauntlet arcade game. It drops the confusing maze aspect and runs with the unique characters in combat. While it is pretty repetitive, the same could arguably be said for the original back in 1985. Repetition is a pretty common problem for arcade games, as they are literally designed for you not to be playing them for very long. Maybe this game is just not all that remarkable, but I chose to remark on it anyway. And although the game has its problems, I do not think it should have spelled doom for the franchise. If you've gotten this far into the video, I commend you. I'm not sure why you're still here, but if you're interested in the Slayer Edition, I suggest grabbing some friends and checking it out.